G'day and welcome to another episode of Cuppa with a Jesuit. I'm Father Robin Koning, the Provincial Assistant for Vocations for the Australian Province.
Father Robin, I'm Julian Butler, a Jesuit in formation, and Father Robin and I are joined today by Father Brendan Byrne. Father Brendan, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with you.
Father Brendan, would you begin maybe by telling us a little bit about your current ministry, what you're working on at the moment?
Well, my current ministry is basically what I've had for about the last 40 years, which is to be a biblical scholar serving the church and scholarship in Australia, sometimes overseas. So I'm still doing that. I am emeritus now. I'm no longer teaching regularly, but I still spend most of my time writing. I give the occasional workshop or retreat as much as COVID allows. But and at the moment, I'm just bringing to conclusion a book on St. Paul, St. Paul's vocabulary, going through all his concepts and trying to write a little bit about them so that this could be a resource for people, I hope students and others who just want a quick reference to what St. Paul says about the church or what he says about salvation or something like that.
You mentioned St. Paul. Where did that interest in Paul begin? And would you share a little with us about how that engagement began with the writing of St. Paul?
Well, I mean, my interest in scripture goes back a bit behind that specific aspect of Paul. But when I was studying theology in preparation for priesthood, I was very taken by, I suppose it's in St. Paul that the theological aspects of the big questions about our faith, they're all out there in front, whereas the Gospels are more focused on the life of Jesus. And of course, there's a tremendous theology in that too. But I just found the questions I was asking in theology were more immediately addressed by St. Paul. What, for example, how does the death of Jesus profit us for salvation? How should we understand grace? I was studying grace at the time, and St. Paul talks about grace. And that's really, it was just as I was leading up to ordination that I got particularly interested in St. Paul.
And that's been many years of work, as you said, on St. Paul, as well as other scriptural writers. And
yes, I mean, I've taught all the Gospels and to some extent the Acts of the Apostles. I love all the Gospels. They're like your children. I suppose you do have favorite ones, but you get to love them all. And but I suppose in terms of my scholarly speciality and perhaps reputation, it's mainly that my heavy books have, insofar as they're heavy, have been written on St. Paul. And that's what I would be known as, particularly around the traps, as a scholar for work on St. Paul, particularly his letter to the Romans.
Mm. And a rather heavy book came out, was it just last year, prior to the one that you're working on now, bringing together a lot of your research, I believe.
Well, I don't want to discourage sales of it by saying it's too heavy, but it was a work that tried to bring together all my thoughts in St. Paul in a more systematic way over about 40 years, called Paul and the Economy of Salvation. It is written for people who can read a bit of Greek and so forth. So it is a fairly scholarly book, but I hope it could be accessible to students of theology and even other people interested in theology who are prepared to sit down and read through the book with a fairly close attention also to the text.
Father Brendan, having talked a bit about the scholarly work and some of the life you've had working on the Gospels and writing popularly, I suppose, about them, maybe to go back to how your engagement with all of this, the world of Scripture, began as a Jesuit, and what drew you to a vocation with the Jesuits as a young man.
Well, I went to a Jesuit school for virtually the age of 6. I crossed the threshold of Xavier College, but I I immediately felt at home, and I went right up through the grades, right up to matriculation. I suppose I always, pretty well always, as far as I can remember, I wanted to be a priest. We weren't an overtly pious home, but we were a good traditional Catholic home, and my parents often entertained priests, and they were very good priests. These were mainly diocesan priests, but my father also was very friendly with Franciscans and Redemptorists. So I got a very good impression of priests, and then I served Mass in the Franciscan retreat house in Kew. And I suppose I was thinking in those terms as I was a young adolescent. But as I got later in my years at school, I came to appreciate the Jesuit teachers more, seeing how I think they combined their priesthood with their teaching. We had some excellent teachers who were Jesuits, but then we had a series about once every 2 months, we'd have High Mass with singing. It was the old Latin Mass, but I loved the Gregorian chant, and we sang it other parts in harmony, and I was part of the choir. They were very moving occasions for me, and the whole school was there, and you saw your teachers there acting as priests on the altar, and that sort of brought the thing together. Then I also found in the playground, they were the priests who were there, you could walk up to them in your last couple of years at school, and they wouldn't talk down, they'd talk to you almost as an adult, and respect what you were saying and ask what you thought about things. And I think that's very affirming for young people to be of that age, when you're about 15, 16, 17. So I felt moved more towards the joining the society, and that was helped by going on retreat to Watsonia, the retreat house there, which the boys from Xavier did in their final years. So I applied to join the society and was accepted. Fairly young. I was only 17, but that was fairly normal at that time. Most of the others who joined with me were of that age, and we turned out to be a very companionable group, and they're very good companions for me, and I owe a great deal to their companionship and their challenge and their stimulus as we went through. So I think that's what drew me to the society.
And you ended up doing doctoral studies over in Oxford, and they were important years for you, weren't they? There were a number of Australian Jesuits there together, a bit of a sub-community of Australians there.
Yes, it was. I really went to Oxford because while I'd been reading in Australia, before I went, I'd been reading some work on St. Paul by a British scholar called Morna Hooker, of Methodist background, who just moved to Oxford. And when you're contemplating a doctorate, it's probably, there are two things. You think of where you might go, but you also think of the person that would be best for you to study with. And I sort of decided that would be the case if she would take me on. And she very kindly did. So I went to Oxford and got involved in the program there to study St. Paul within the Doctorate of Philosophy program. And when I first met her in her office in 1972, standing there at exactly the same time was another Australian priest, a Salesian called Frank Maloney. We hadn't met in Melbourne. They were the same age, but he came from the west of the river. I came from the east. Our paths hadn't crossed, but he studied parallel. We studied in parallel. He did John's Gospel. I did St. Paul, and we've remained very fast friends and supporters and colleagues ever since.
Brendan, there's much that seems incredibly rich and engaging about the work that you've done as a Jesuit. I wonder if you might share with us anything that you've found particularly challenging about being a Jesuit. Is there anything about the vocation that's hard or that's challenging?
Well, I think people think of us as a very intellectual order, and we do have a fairly solid, and rightly, I think, from our origins in the universities of Paris, we do have a solid commitment to intellectual work. I suppose because I'm reasonably bright myself, it wasn't the actual studies that were so much of a challenge. I'm not sure that I've always been happy in the society. I've always found myself in communities that are very likable. I mean, there are always some people who get on better with others. But I found both in Australia and then overseas, I've been in the United States, I've been in Britain, of course, I've been in Vietnam and Korea and worked there. And I just, and Africa too, I was in Kenya for a few months teaching. I've just found, even though people are from very different cultures and very different ethnic backgrounds, there's some common thing that one finds, and yeah, that's good. I suppose the biggest challenge I faced, really, if I think back on it, though it may not seem too much to other people who confront much more difficult things, but I found it hard to get, even though I wanted to study St. Paul in Oxford, I found it very hard to get a topic precisely enough for a doctorate. And this went on for almost a year. And I was really struggling, getting very distressed about this. And I was down in London during the Christmas time, I think it was. And I sort of was very downhearted about this. I was in a parish there. And I remember one afternoon, I sort of thought, look, I just think this may not work. I may have to go back. I may have to say to the provincial, look, I can't do this. I'll have to come back and find something else. And somehow or other, accepting that possibility, I'd felt, as soon as I'd done that afternoon, I was almost felt I'd hit sitting on the floor. I wasn't on the floor, but I felt that. I suddenly felt I was coming up again. Somehow or other, the acceptance of that, this has been a pattern I've found with a lot of things that are difficult in life. When you sort of accept that you might have to humbly say, you can't do this, you get given some clarity. And I think I got up and went ahead, and then I met another scholar who was visiting, a Dominican priest called Jeremy Murphy O'Connor, Irishman, who was visiting Oxford at the time. And I'd met him before, and he just gave me a little prod. He just said, get on with it. And it was just what I needed at that moment. So that there've been occasions like that in my life.
And if you were talking to a young man today who was considering religious life, Jesuit life, have any words of advice for him?
I think advice is difficult and perhaps not appropriate. But I mean, let's face it, I was very young when I joined the society, as were most of my companions. But within the Catholic culture of the time, which was very strong, that was not a countercultural thing to do. That was a high, very admirable thing to do. And although I wasn't at all prominent, I wasn't a great sportsman or very prominent in the school, I wasn't a prefect or anything like that. Sometimes the boys at school who'd been captain of the school or captain of the football, or very, very much admired boys in an Australian context, they were the ones who joined. So it was a path in that sense that was easy, and great support from one's family and relatives and so forth. Now, over half a century later, to join a religious order is a very countercultural thing if one thinks in terms of Australian culture. And I think it requires a very, very great level of faith, of deep faith, and a sense of, well, I want to give my life to serve, to be captured by Christ, as St. Paul says, and I want to give that to the service of my fellow human beings. And I think the society offers a marvelous, as St. Ignatius, it's a pathway to God. But Ignatius, the specific thing about our Jesuits' vocation is it's a pathway through the service of soul, or the service of others in all the sort of ways that as in the society you can do, as an astronomer or something like that, as much as a missionary or a parish priest or a teacher, whatever. And I think when I think of my own limitations and so forth, personally and so forth, the society has a great ability with our training to take people and multiply their talents. I mean, I had no conception that I'd be able to do what, through God's grace, I suppose, I have done as a scripture scholar, with a bit of an international reputation, to be immodest about it, and to be able to do that because the society just gives you so much opportunity. I don't underestimate the tremendous challenge and the very radical thing it is for a young person to follow Christ in this way in these times. But I've been happy.
Brendan, thank you very much for your time today and for sharing all the various aspects of your life and your own vocation story. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you.
Okay, pleasure.